And I have to thank Vivaldo for inviting me to make this introduction, because I had the opportunity of learning about a very interesting scientist. He has a degree in biology, but also a degree in philosophy. He directs the Center of History and Philosophy of Sciences at École Normale, and his career was developed at the molecular biology department of the Institut Pasteur. From 71 to 80, he worked at the laboratory of Henri Buch as a doctoral student and then as a postdoctoral researcher, where he was in the lab of biological macromolecules. From 80 to 86, he was in the laboratory of molecular genetics of François Jacob. And it was during this period that he made a very important contribution in partnership with Olivier Bansoud. I learned, and I checked with Vivaldo, that his discovery was a very important one. He realized that certain specific type of stress protein, the so-called thermal shock proteins, they were specifically expressed in the early development of embryogenic development of mice. From 86 until 90, he was a co-director of a laboratory on molecular biology of stress created at the Institut Pasteur. And then from 91 to 2008, he became the director of the molecular biology of stress laboratory at École Normale. He has many publications, but apart from that, he's written many books. In fact, it's a long list, so I will read. His first book is a very important book on the history of biology. He wrote a book on the history of molecular biology. This book was first appeared in French in '94, but it was translated into English. It's called the History of Molecular Biology, Harvard University Press, '98. Then a second book called La Part de Gène, '98, also translated as the Misunderstood Gene, Harvard University Press, 2001. There's a third one called La Vie Expliquée, 50 ans après la double hélice, which was translated into English, Life Explained, Yale University Press, 2008, and many others, À quoi sert l'histoire des sciences, also La Vie, l'évolution et l'histoire. All of these books on the impact of the French School of Molecular Biology in the evolution of the field. He has been the recipient of several prizes, one of them a very distinguished prize on scientific information given by the Académie des Sciences in France in 2005. So it is really an honor, and on vous remercie de votre participation, et à vous la parole.
Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. And I want to thank the Brazilian Academy of Science, Vivaldo, all the people who contributed to my coming. I want also to thank the French consulate in Rio de Janeiro for funding, but also because they were able to solve the very difficult passport problem I had just before coming here. You have done, you are doing an experiment today. You will hear two French guys, one speaking perfect Portuguese, and the other one who is unable to speak in Portuguese, me. And also these two people are from the same French institution, École Normale Supérieure. So I apologize not to be able to speak in Portuguese, and I will speak in English. So when Henri Poincaré wrote his book about the value of science 110 years ago, I think the situation was very different from now. clearly the applications of science were not as important as they are today. For instance, well, at the time of Poincaré, electricity was important. There were progresses in microbiology, in the fight against disease. But nevertheless, there was nothing comparable to what happens today with our iPads and things like that, which are marvels of science. And in fact, we use them. Technology is everywhere around us. We use technology, and this technology is based on science. But in contrast, at the time of Poincaré, I think most people, maybe not all, but most people consider that there was a value of science, a value for an increase of knowledge, that scientific knowledge was something important, that it was truth, telling truth about the world, telling truth about reality. Today, though, we have these applications of science everywhere, but there are some doubts about the value of scientific knowledge in our societies. And what I would like to do just in this lecture is first not address the problem of science application, which probably were very important for maybe this decrease in the confidence in science. But first I will examine from a philosophical point of view the criticisms that were addressed to scientific knowledge, in particular during the second half of the 20th century. And the second part of my talk will be to find in François Jacob's writings about history and philosophy of science arguments to defend science against these attacks. And it will be also a way to pay a tribute to François Jacob, to his scientific contributions, but also to his philosophical contribution and to the person. So, the doubts about the value of scientific knowledge. I will examine very rapidly some of the criticism of some of the limits of scientific knowledge that have been outlined recently. Not recently for all of them, since there is a long philosophical tradition trying to show the limits of scientific knowledge. For instance, you know probably 18th century Hume telling that in fact there is a problem of induction. In science, you do generalities, you extract laws, but somehow you have no right to say that there are laws in nature, because you only have some examples of events. It's not because something happened yesterday that it will happen tomorrow. This was a criticism done so very early, and another criticism addressed by Kant, and we heard a lot about Kant, but Kant making a distinction between phenomena, which are studied by science, and things as they are, that are studied by maybe philosophy, but not by science. Science is unable, scientists are unable to tell something significant on reality. They only can explain phenomena. Okay, but I think this criticism did not prevent science to progressing and to telling more and more about the world. In the 20th century, there was another new and somehow very interesting criticism, or at least limit to science, which was established by Karl Popper, the philosopher Karl Popper. In fact, Karl Popper was responding to an attempt by a group of philosophers in Vienna called the Vienna Circle to try to build a secure, a sure science. The idea of the Vienna Circle that science was good because somehow it was based on well-established facts and observation, and from this observation people had established some propositions, and these propositions were true, and science could be built on this true proposition. But this program was criticized by many other philosophers, telling that in fact it's never sure that you have made the right observation. And in addition, due to human language, it's impossible to really have right proposition. So the idea of this Vienna Circle, that scientific knowledge was different from other forms of knowledge because it was based on more sure proposition, more sure proposition, better proposition, was criticized. And Karl Popper tried to answer to this criticism by looking for another criterion demarcating science, scientific knowledge, from other forms of knowledge. You probably, many of you know the criterion of Popper, which was that science is good, not because his hypotheses are of a different nature, but simply because hypotheses in science can be falsified. They can be submitted to the sieve of experiment. And so this is a demarcation between scientific knowledge and other knowledge. Not the true content as such, but the fact that scientific hypotheses, law, theories, can be permanently submitted to this form of criticism. There is a problem in the theory of Karl Popper, because, okay, it seems quite well, but when, for instance, you consider the movement of the Earth around the Sun, it looks curious to say that finally this idea that Earth turns around the Sun and not the opposite is somehow only an hypothesis, that maybe tomorrow there will be new observation which will demonstrate the opposite. We have the feeling, all scientists have the feeling, and even the public has the feeling that scientific knowledge is more than that. It's not so provisory. And Popper himself was somehow clearly understood this problem, and he tried to reintroduce a concept of truth in scientific knowledge, speaking about verisimilarity, meaning that scientific knowledge is not absolutely sure, but nevertheless some of the theories in science have been tested so many times that we can have a good confidence that they are very close from what happens in nature, from reality. But these philosophical criticisms were not the most serious criticism addressed to science. Historians also criticized science, and you know the famous work of Thomas Kuhn and the idea of paradigms and incommensurable paradigms. A paradigm is something which is very difficult to define. In fact, it was not clear even in Kuhn's writings. There were many meanings. But the idea was that in science you have theories, you have models, you have observed facts, but you have also plenty of other things, a sort of metaphysics or ontology in science, and also the fact that one science at one given time selects a certain number of questions and a certain number of explanations which can be given. But if the observation of Kuhn led to the idea that you have a succession of paradigms, and that these paradigms are incommensurable, which means that because they are very complex, you cannot compare one paradigm to another. You cannot say immediately that one paradigm is better than another. And so it was somehow the door open to the criticism of the idea of scientific progress. Because if a new paradigm is not better than the previous one, so there is no longer scientific progress. You know that the paradigms were very popular, fashionable even among scientists. I think because many scientists dreamed to somehow discover and to create a new paradigm. But the most radical and apparently devastating criticisms came from social scientists from the middle of the 1970s. What the program was very interesting. It was to simply try to describe as precisely as possible how scientific knowledge is constructed. Not the mythical description which are often given, but really follow, when possible, day by day, the construction of a new model, a new theory, a new mechanism, for instance. And the result was to somehow to reveal that in this process many things participate which are not considered as belonging to science. For instance, the strategies of the actors, their ambitions, and so on and so on. And from this observation, which is somehow mundane, came the idea that, in fact, if you have a scientific controversy, so at one time two models, two hypotheses, one against the other, maybe at the end, the fact that one theory, one model will be conserved, will be privileged, will be for reasons which will not be scientific reasons, but simply because one actors were more, let's say, active, more able to persuade other people that their theory was good. And if you accept this idea, one can imagine that now we have a science which would have been better if this kind of extra scientific pressures would not have played their role, because somehow we adopted a bad theory or model. This was so from what was called constructivism, the idea that scientific knowledge is constructed progressively, came among some social scientists the idea that scientific knowledge has a relative value. It's not different from other forms of knowledge. So what to think about all this criticism? One possible answer would be to say, okay, it's not so serious because science is always progressing, plenty of new results, so do not worry about this criticism. But I think the impact on the society was stronger than we can imagine. And somehow a diffuse impact on the society, but diffuse, but I think important and dangerous for science. And I would only take one example about recent reform of education in France, which occurred 3 years ago. You know, in France, we, probably in other countries, but we enjoy doing reforms of education. Every new government introduces a new reform, which is theoretically better than the previous one, in practice, which is only different in many cases. But nevertheless, what was interesting is this reform was the place of science. When you read the program of the reform, culture was mentioned. Education must introduce young children to culture of their time. But in culture, there was no science. Culture was only art, humanities. Science, it was useful to understand the technologies which surround us. So teaching science was important only to help us to master the technology which surround us. Which is okay. It was improved in the later, but at the beginning it was exactly this kind of description which was given. And why scientific? It was said also that it's not so important to teach scientific knowledge. Why? Because scientific knowledge changes permanently. So it's somehow a bad consequence of Thomas Kuhn. So it is only necessary to teach scientific method. But I think, okay, it's good to teach scientific method, but it's also good to teach scientific results, what science has already brought to our understanding of the world. So what can be answered? I think it's possible to answer to many to these studies that many of them were too superficial to really tell something significant about science. Personally, I know a little history of science, and in many cases, these studies were, in fact, not entering into the detail of scientific work. But in particular, I think this study did not pay enough attention to the weight of experimentation, to the fact that scientists do experiment, and if experiments are not giving the results, the theory will be abandoned. You cannot convince your colleagues only if you have persuasive. You must bring experiment and results of experiment. And also, all these issues were in fact not considering the fact that the scientific community is a very active community, discussing, criticizing, and so the risk to accept a bad theory of model is quite limited. I just want to take one example about a famous historical controversy between Pasteur and Pouchet on spontaneous generation. I think that in Brazil, Pasteur is somebody very important. It is also in France, but I think also in Brazil. And why? Because this controversy has been revisited by social scientists, and I would like to show the kind of arguments they use and the answers which can be given. So, traditional description says that Pasteur did experiments between 1859 and 1864 on spontaneous generation, that this experiment convinced all the scientific community, French Academy, but the scientific community and even the public in general, that there was no spontaneous generation. And why? Because these experiments were of a high quality. What were the criticisms addressed to this traditional presentation? The first point was to say, okay, but who decided, in fact? It was a commission of the French Academy of Science. All the members of the commission were friends of Pasteur. So, even if Pasteur had presented bad experiments, they would probably have supported Pasteur and not Pouchet. Second argument, in fact, probably some of the experiments done by Pouchet were not wrong, because Pouchet observed some spontaneous generation in the flask he was manipulating, and it's possible he used a different medium of Pasteur. It's possible that in this condition there were spores in this media, and that the heat treatment was not sufficient to destroy them. So maybe Pouchet was not a bad experimenter, but in fact he really observed in his condition of experiment some apparently spontaneous generation. So if you accept this criticism, you can say, okay, the problem was not really solved by the controversy. But in fact, there are flaws in this criticism. The first is when you look at the experiment, it's clear that the method of Pasteur is far better than the method of Pouchet. Pasteur applies what is called hypothetical-deductive method of science. And in this case, what is it? It means that Pasteur says if spontaneous generation is due to a contamination by germs, in this case, it will be possible to retain this germ, for instance, on long surfaces of glass, and it was a famous swan neck experiment done by Pasteur. If contamination is due to germs, the abundance of germs is probably not the same in the Alps, in mountains, and at the ground level, and he did a series of experiments at different levels. So he was really using this method. What Pouchet was doing was simply to reproduce permanently the same experiments. Take flask, heat them, and show that despite the heating, you had some appearance of microorganisms in the flask. So, best method for Pasteur. But second point, if Pasteur was supported by the Academy of Science and the Commission, it's for good scientific reason. In fact, spontaneous generation had started to disappear, at least in the mind of biologists, from centuries. The idea that mice could originate by spontaneous generation was abandoned at the Renaissance, after you had the experiment of Reddy showing that mosquitoes cannot start immediately from meat, abandoned meat. And in the 19th century, somehow, nobody was really believing in spontaneous generation now. So what was expected were good experiments showing that there was no spontaneous generation. It was a problem which was somehow already solved. In particular, because something which has been forgotten in all this description, 1859 is the time where the cellular theory is finally adopted, meaning that every cell comes from another cell. In this theory, it's clear that you cannot have spontaneous generation. And the last point I think to mention, in fact, it's often said Pasteur closed the debate. The question was over. Yes, but for one good reason, because nobody reopened the debate. And the debate was not reopened because, in fact, no experiment, no arguments demonstrated the possibility of a spontaneous generation in the following years. So all this has been somehow forgotten in the criticism of addressed by social scientists. But I will stop now and come back to what François Jacob says on these issues. Just at the beginning, you have a photograph of François Jacob when he probably both day science and night science. It's difficult to say that it's more one type of science than the other, because it's day science in the sense that it can be reasonable to ask one question or another at one given time. But at the same time, it's night science because it's only during this night period of science that you are able to see eventually possible changes, possible recombinations which would lead to another vision of the phenomena. So rationally you can say it would be an important question, but you need this night time to really see whether it's a good time, the right time to recombine and to find new way to address these questions. So I think both participate to this issue, to find the right questions which can be solved at a given time.
You're not supposed to sleep, both day and night.
My name is Bruno. I'm from UFRJ, Federal University of Rio. My question is more about the future. If you think about graduate students and postdocs nowadays, the way that science pushes is a lot of day science and not much of night science. So the pressure for an amount of publications, how this system can be fixed in that? I know that's a complex question, but
but I know it's a very important question. Yes, I agree that the present system of funding, of forming young scientists, graduate students, is a system which do not leave enough possibilities of precisely wandering in the night in some sense and trying to find original solution to all problems and so on. You must have clear-cut results in 3 years of your PhD. I think it's a very serious problem, as is translational research, for instance. We have an organization of science which do not respect somehow these two phases of science and has forgotten this night phase of science. Clearly, I think it will have to change. Otherwise, the problem, I think, is otherwise you will select categories of young researchers who will not be probably the most creative ones. We will select people able to do what they are trained to do very efficiently, but not the people susceptible in 15, 12, in 10, 20, 50 years to really have a new vision to recombine in a very original way. That's my point of view. I think you agree probably.
Okay, we'll take two more questions. One from Helena Nader. She is the president of the Brazilian Society for the Progress of Science, so she believes in the progress of science.
I hope so. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk. But I got kind of confused. Where the science with GMOs, where do they rest? Because we have lots of science with GMOs. Where do you think it would apply? Because you said you're not taking GMOs into this whole talk.
You think a problem like GMOs, like nuclear energy, is kind of problem scientists are facing?
Yeah, the GMOs specifically.
GMOs. Okay. I will give my answer, but I think it's subject of a long debate. And my answer, which is the answer somehow coming from what happened in France, not only, but what happened in France. I think the problem of GMO is not so much a scientific issue. It's more a question of defending a certain form of agriculture against, for instance, big enterprise, big industries who try to reduce all the plants to one unique type, which try to somehow organize the peasants and the life of the peasants and the way they are working. And I think most of the opposition to GMO are coming from that. People refuse to be engaged in such an organization. The question of transgenesis, adding genes and the opposition it raised, I think probably this issue might have been solved. Might have been solved by explaining what was done and that it was not so unnatural as many people consider. But it was not because of this huge social movement against people, peasants, and who oppose this. And in fact, you have a mixture which makes that the situation is now completely bucked, but not because people oppose the introduction of new genes, but because they oppose a certain form of organization of agriculture, I think. I guess maybe it's not too different here, but Brazil, but I think, okay, it was, and probably at the beginning, scientists were responsible not to see this complex picture behind the direct modification of plants. They only saw the technical problem and that could be raised simply. They did not see that you had Monsanto and you had this kind of organization behind, which in fact were responsible for the rejection of this measure.
I would invite them, Martin Targa for a last question, and then I have to make a few announcements before we break for lunch.
So I'll try to be brief. My first observation is a comment. The question of how to choose good candidates with daylight or nighttime scientists. This is an important one. I'm just quote something that I read recently, that this more or less this question in this same direction was raised in 1850 by Eisenhower. And this a funny thing, he said that he was complaining about the lack of, let's say, small curiosity and all this kind of input of curiosity into science. And the reason that he stated that is that since science became a very expensive situation, I mean, with a very complex laboratories, machinery, installation and all that, then the problem passes from the size of an individual matter of curiosity by something that the government should be heavily to put on to support all this activity, which became more complex. So in this sense, because of the involvement of the government and all these complex organizations in order to fund the science, then the organizer or administrators, the staff, the managers, they have to have something very clear on what to base sending a lot of money to people for the researchers. And in this sense, because of this diminishing or a desire of diminishing the uncertainty, then they choose the daylight and do not risk anymore into the nighttime. So this is a very important thing, and I think we are following this to the bitter end, in the sense that people only support research when they see very clearly that it points to a definite goal.
Yeah.
And this is day science, this is not night.
Yeah. I am absolutely right. That's a problem.
I will, first of all, ask you to thank again our speaker for this very nice talk.